The dust was the first thing and the last. It was the alpha of her mornings, a pale shroud on the windowsill, and the omega of her nights, a grit between her teeth. Ruth and Arlen breathed it in, lived with it coating her tongue, felt it settle in the deep lines that life had carved around her eyes and mouth. It was the fine milled bone of the land, a constant reminder of the drought that had claimed the creek, the cattle, and then, one by one, her sons. 3 graves she tended, marked by stones she had pulled from the ungiving earth herself. 3 small mounds under a solitary skeletal mesquite that offered no shade, only a lattice of stark shadows against the baked ground. Amen, Samuel, little Finn. Their names were a silent rosary she counted on the beads of her spine as she knelt, her knees pressing into the hard-pan soil. She did not weep. The tears had dried up with the river, leaving behind only the salt sting of their memory. Her grief was a physical thing, a hollowed-out space in her chest where the wind seemed to blow straight through. The silence was her husband, Thomas, gone 2 years now. He had left her with the ranch, the debt, and the quiet that hummed with the ghosts of all the words he'd never said. He had been a man of loud actions and few syllables, his love a rough-hewn thing, sturdy, but without comfort. He had built the house, dug the well, fought the land, and lost. His heart had simply given out, a quiet surrender after a life of noise. Ruthen had buried him next to their boys, another stone in the collection, the largest of them all. Her days were a ritual of survival, a slow, deliberate march against the entropy of the plains. She woke before the sun had summoned the courage to crest the horizon, its light a weak, milky wash in the east. She mended the fences the wind tried to steal, coaxed a few stubborn vegetables from her parched garden, and sat on the porch as the sun bled across the sky, watching the world turn to rust and ember. The house was a shell, its rooms echoing with the footfalls of children who no longer ran its halls. Their toys, their small, scuffed boots, the notches on the doorframe marking their growth, all were relics of a life that felt like another woman's story. She had learned to read the land in a way she had never read a book. She knew the scuttling language of lizards, the patient spiral of a hawk on a thermal, the way the air tasted just before a dust storm. The land was a harsh god, but a consistent one. It took without asking, but it never lied. It was this honesty, this brutal clarity that she clung to. In a world stripped of softness, there was a strange comfort in the unforgiving. This morning was like all the others. The air was still, heavy with the promise of heat. A film of ochre dust covered the tin cup on the porch rail. Ruthen stood, her hand braced against the raw timber of the post, and watched the eastern sky pale. There was no sound but the thrum of insects, a low, constant vibration that was the land's own heartbeat. Then, a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision. It was not a coyote or a stray longhorn. It was a man, on foot, emerging from the shimmering heat haze where the scrubland met the sky. He moved with a liquid grace that was alien to this place of brittle, sharp edges. He was not of her world. His skin was the color of rich earth, his black hair long and unbound. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his chest and back bare, adorned with the faint painted tracery of symbols she did not recognize. He was Comanche. Fear was a cold stone in Ruthen's belly. She had heard the stories, the whispers of raids and stolen children that were the dark folklore of the frontier. Her hand tightened on the porch post, her knuckles white. She should run, bar the door, find the old shotgun Thomas had kept above the hearth. But she was rooted to the spot, held by a force as powerful as fear, a profound, unnerving curiosity. He did not approach the house directly, but walked a wide, deliberate arc, his eyes fixed on her. There was no menace in his gaze, only an unnerving intensity, a deep, bottomless quiet that seemed to swallow the morning sounds. He carried no weapon she could see, only a bundle in his arms, wrapped in a faded trade blanket. He stopped at the foot of the 3 rickety porch steps. The silence stretched, taut and thin. He was close enough now that she could see the fine lines of dust on his skin, the sweat beading on his temples. He smelled of sage and smoke and something else, something wild and ancient. He did not speak. His language was in the slow, deliberate way he moved. He knelt, not in supplication, but with a kind of innate dignity, and gently placed the bundle on the lowest step. Then he straightened, his eyes meeting hers one last time. In their dark depths, she saw not a threat, but a sorrow so vast it mirrored her own. It was a look of shared, unspeakable loss. Then he turned and walked away, melting back into the heat and the dust from which he had come, leaving only the bundle and a silence that was now heavier, more profound, than the one that had preceded him. Ruthen's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She stared at the bundle on the step, her mind a maelstrom of confusion and terror. It could be anything, a trap, a curse, a warning. She should leave it, let the sun and the coyotes claim it. But a sound, small and fragile, pricked the heavy silence. A soft, mewling cry, like a kitten. It was a sound of life. Her body moved before her mind could protest. She descended the steps, her bare feet hesitant on the sun-warmed wood. She knelt, her hands trembling, and reached for the blanket. The wool was coarse beneath her fingers. She pulled back a corner, her breath catching in her throat. It was a baby, a tiny, perfect, sleeping baby. Its skin was a shade darker than her own, a warm, dusky copper. A tuft of jet-black hair crowned its head. It was swaddled tightly, its small fists curled near a face that was serene in sleep. It was a boy. And then she saw his eyes. He stirred, his eyelids fluttering open, and Ruthen felt the world tilt on its axis. The eyes that blinked up at her were not the dark liquid brown of the man who had brought him. They were her eyes. The same startling, pale smoke gray as her own, the color of a winter sky, an anomaly in her family of brown-eyed sons, a trait inherited from a grandmother she'd never known. They were the eyes she saw in her own reflection every morning, haunted and familiar. The shock was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. This was impossible, a madness born of sun and grief. She was hallucinating, her lonely mind conjuring phantoms. She looked wildly around, searching for the Comanche man, for some sign that this was real, but there was only the empty, shimmering land. The baby whimpered again. A small, insistent sound that cut through her paralysis. It was a sound that demanded a response. Her hands, the same hands that had buried 3 sons, moved with an instinct she thought had been buried with them. She gathered the bundle into her arms. The weight was a shock, so light and yet so substantial. It had been years since she had held a child. The feeling was a ghost limb, an ache of memory in her muscles. She carried him into the house, the cool, dim interior a respite from the glare of the sun and the enormity of what had just happened. She laid him on the rough-hewn table, the same table where she had served her family 1,000 meals, and unwrapped him completely. He was whole, unblemished, a marvel of miniature limbs and perfect, tiny fingers. Tucked into the swaddling was a small leather pouch on a thong. It contained a dried herb with a sharp medicinal scent and a single polished river stone, smooth and dark. Nothing more. No note. No explanation. Only the impossible truth of his eyes. The baby began to cry in earnest now, a thin, hungry wail that filled the silent house. The sound was a key, unlocking rooms in her heart she had sealed shut. The sound of a life that needed her. Ruthen moved like a woman in a dream. She found an old, soft linen shirt of Thomas's and tore it into strips for diapers. She warmed goat's milk from the nanny goat she kept, her movements clumsy at first, then more certain, guided by the powerful, deep-seated memory of mothering. She fashioned a makeshift teat from a piece of clean leather and painstakingly taught the baby to drink. He latched on with a surprising strength, his small body tense with need, his gray eyes fixed on her face. As the milk quieted him, a profound and terrifying thought took root in Ruthen's mind. This child, this impossible gift, was not a stranger. The blood that ran in his veins, the blood that had colored his eyes with the ghost of her own lineage, was connected to her. But how? The days that followed were a blur of primal needs. The baby, whom she did not name, became the sun around which her world now turned. His cries were the new clock, his hunger the new calendar. She fed him, changed him, bathed him in a basin of precious, carefully drawn well water. She held him against her chest, his small head tucked under her chin, and felt the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her own. The hollow space inside her began to fill, not with joy, but with a fierce, terrifying purpose. She did not think about the Comanche man. She did not allow herself to question the how or the why. She simply existed, moment to moment, in the service of this new, fragile life. At night, she placed him in a wooden crate beside her bed, the same crate that had once held Finn's few toys. She would lie awake in the darkness, listening to the soft sounds of his breathing, a counterpoint to the lonely howl of the wind outside. For the first time in 2 years, the silence in the house was not empty. It was waiting. The land watched her. The hawk that circled overhead seemed to follow her as she hung the tiny makeshift diapers on the line, bright white flags of surrender to a fate she had not chosen. The coyotes seemed to howl a new question in the night. She was no longer just the grieving widow, the silent woman of the plains. She was something else now, something strange and new, a mother to a child with no name and an impossible story. Her first trip into the small, dusty settlement of Redemption was a trial by fire. She needed supplies, more milk, cloth. She wrapped the baby tightly and secured him to her chest in a sling she had fashioned from a blanket, his face hidden from view. The 10-mile ride in the buckboard was a slow, rattling journey into a world she had long since abandoned. The town was little more than a single dusty street, flanked by a handful of clapboard buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a church whose steeple seemed to lean in perpetual prayer. The moment she stepped down from the buckboard, she felt the change. The usual nods of somber acknowledgement from the townspeople were replaced by stares, curious, probing, suspicious stares. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, a woman whose piety was as starched as her apron, stopped sweeping the boardwalk as Ruthen approached. Her eyes, small and sharp, darted from Ruthen's face to the bundle on her chest. "Ruthen," she said, her voice tight, "we hadn't seen you in an age. We thought—" She trailed off, her gaze unwavering. "I needed supplies," Ruthen said, her voice raspy from disuse. The baby chose that moment to stir, letting out a small cry. Mrs. Gable's eyes widened. Before she could ask the question that was burning on her lips, Ruthen pushed past her and into the dim, cluttered interior of the store. The whispers followed her down the aisle. The melodies were cracked and broken, fragments of a forgotten language, but they seemed to soothe him. She held him close, his terror a mirror of the storm raging inside her own heart. Who was he? Where did he come from? What did his existence mean for her? The questions she had so carefully suppressed now rose up, demanding answers. She was a woman who had built her life on the solid ground of fact and hard work. This mystery, this miracle, was a fissure in that foundation, threatening to swallow her whole. It was in the pre-dawn quiet, after the storm had passed and the world was washed clean and new, that she found the letter. She had been searching for a warmer blanket for the baby, rummaging through the old wooden chest at the foot of her bed. a repository of things she could not bear to part with. Finn's first tiny shoes, a lock of Samuel's hair, Eamon's clumsy drawings. Her fingers brushed against a leather-bound ledger she did not recognize. It was Thomas's journal, a thing she never knew he kept. His handwriting, like the man himself, was blocky and forceful. Most of the entries were terse, practical notes about the ranch, fences mended, cattle sold, weather patterns. But tucked into the back, folded into a tight, neat square, was a single sheet of paper, the writing on it different. It was hurried, frantic. The ink bled and feathered in places, as if stained by sweat or tears. It was a letter, and it was addressed to her. My dearest Ruthin. The words were a shock. Thomas had never been one for endearments. Her hands began to tremble as she read. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and my greatest sin has found its way to your door. I pray to a God I am no longer sure I believe in that it never does, that this confession can die with me. But I know the world has a long memory, and justice of a kind always finds its way home. Ruthin's blood ran cold. She sat on the edge of the bed, the sleeping baby a warm weight in the crate beside her. You remember the year of the raids, the spring the Comanche came down from the north, angry and starving. You were with your sister, helping with her birthing. I told you I joined the posse, that we rode out to push them back, to protect our homes. That was the truth, but it was not the whole truth. We were not just protectors, Ruthin. We were filled with rage and whiskey and a righteousness that was poison. We tracked them for 3 days. We found their camp. It was not a war party. It was old men, women, children. They were weak, their horses thin. We fell on them like wolves. The letter shook in her hand. She could hear the thunder of hooves, the screams, the chaos Thomas's spare words evoked. I am not proud of what I did that day. I have seen the faces of the men I killed in my dreams every night since. But that is not my deepest shame. My deepest shame has a name. Her name was Nakona. It means wanderer. She fought back, not with a weapon, but with her eyes. They were fierce and proud, and they looked at me with a hatred so pure it burned me to the soul. In the madness, in the bloodlust, I took her. It was not love. It was not lust. It was an act of desecration, of power, of a darkness in me I never knew existed. I broke her. I left her for dead. Ruthin felt a wave of nausea. This was not her Thomas. This was a monster wearing his skin. The man who had held her, who had fathered her children, was capable of this. But she did not die. A year later, a traitor who knew of my shame came to me. He told me she had survived, and that she had borne a son, my son. A child with my blood and, he said, with the eyes of my people, my grandmother's eyes, your eyes. Ruthin let out a strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at the sleeping baby, at the impossible truth of his face. She could not keep him. She wanted to scream, to rage, to take the child back to the place he had come from and leave him there. He was not hers. He was a living wound, a testament to a betrayal so profound it desecrated the memory of her own dead sons. How could she love him? How could she even look at him without seeing the horror of his conception? She stood up, her body trembling, and walked to the window. The world outside was washed in the clean, pale light of dawn. The air smelled of rain and wet earth. It was a world of second chances, of new beginnings. But for her, there was only the wreckage of the past. She was Ruthin Arlen, a widow who had buried 3 sons. And now she was the mother of a 4th, a child whose bloodline shamed her own, whose existence was a constant aching reminder of the price of a secret her husband had taken to his grave. The baby began to cry, a soft, questioning sound in the quiet room. It was the sound of a life that depended on her. Ruthen closed her eyes. The whispers of the town were nothing. The judgment of her neighbors was a puff of smoke. The only judgment that mattered now was her own. Could she be the mother to this child? Could she carry the name of the woman her husband had left to die? Could she look at Tabernanica and see not the sin of the father, but the soul of the son? She turned from the window and walked back to the crate. She looked down at the crying baby, his face crumpled in distress, his tiny hands reaching for her. She saw the ghost of Thomas in the set of his jaw, the shadow of a strange, proud woman in the curve of his cheek. And she saw the startling, familiar gray of her own eyes, filled with tears. She reached down, her hands no longer trembling, and lifted him into her arms. She held him against her heart, his cries slowly quieting as he felt her warmth, her strength. "Tabernanica," she whispered, the name feeling foreign and yet strangely right on her tongue. Voice of the Son. She would not be damned by her husband's legacy. She would defy it. She would raise this child. She would love him. Not because he was Thomas's son, but because he was Nokona's. She would be the mother this child deserved, the keeper of a story that needed to be told, not buried. In the ashes of her husband's betrayal, she would find a new purpose. She would carry the name of the wanderer, and in doing so, perhaps, find her own way home. The seasons turned, grinding on with the slow, inexorable power of a millstone. The fierce heat of summer bled into the brittle chill of autumn, and the plains turned from scorched brown to a pale, wheaten gold. Tabernanica grew. He was a quiet, watchful child, his gray eyes seeming to absorb the world with a solemn intensity. He learned to crawl on the rough floorboards of the cabin, his small hands and knees covered in a fine layer of ever-present dust. He learned to pull himself up on the legs of the table, his grunts of effort the loudest sounds in the house. Ruthen's love for him was not a gentle, blossoming thing. It was a gnarled root, tough and tenacious, that had taken hold in the barren soil of her heart. It was a fierce, protective love, forged in defiance and watered with a sorrow that was no longer just her own. She saw in him not the specter of Thomas's sin, but the fierce, unbroken spirit of his mother, Nokona. She spoke the name aloud sometimes, in the quiet of the evenings, a prayer to a woman she had never known. "Nokona," she would whisper to the sleeping child, "your son is safe." The world outside the small patch of land she called home remained hostile. Her trips to redemption were infrequent and fraught with a silent tension. The whispers had not died down. They had solidified into a hard, cold certainty in the eyes of the townspeople. She was the pariah, the woman who had consorted with savages. The child was the living proof. They gave her a wide berth on the street, their silence more damning than any accusation. Elspeth Miller once spat on the ground as she passed, her face a mask of righteous contempt. Ruthen did not flinch. Their hatred was a thin, bitter gruel compared to the rich, complex stew of her own emotions. She found a strange freedom in their ostracism. She was no longer bound by their expectations, their small-minded morality. She was an island, she and the boy, and their world was defined by the vast, empty horizon and the endless sky. She taught him the names of the plants in her garden, the call of the mourning dove, the feel of the wind. She would sit with him on the porch steps, the same steps where he had been left, and point to the constellations wheeling in the ink-black sky. He was her student, her companion, her reason. One afternoon, as she was digging potatoes from the hard earth, she felt a familiar prickling on the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. She straightened slowly, her hand shielding her eyes against the low autumn sun. At the edge of her property, where the fence line met the open plains, 2 riders sat on their horses. They were still as statues, their figures dark silhouettes against the bright sky. They were Comanche. Her heart leaped into her throat. This was it. They had come for him. The fear was a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. She had known this day would come, had rehearsed it in her mind 1,000 times, but the reality of it was a paralyzing terror. Tabananica, who had been playing in the dust near her feet, grew still. He looked towards the riders, his small head cocked, a look of solemn curiosity on his face. He was not afraid. Ruthin stood frozen, the trowel falling from her hand. She could not run, she could not hide him. There was nowhere to go. She could only wait. The riders did not move. They simply sat, their gaze fixed on the small house, on the woman and the child. They were not a war party. They were watchers, their presence a silent, powerful question. They were not there to take him. Not yet. They were there to see. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The air grew cold. Still they sat. Ruthin's fear slowly began to recede, replaced by a strange, dawning understanding. This was not an invasion. It was a vigil. She picked up Tabananica, his small, solid body a comfort against her own. She walked back to the house, her movements deliberate, her back straight. She did not run. She would not show them fear. She would show them a mother protecting her child. She lit a lamp in the window, a small beacon of defiance in the gathering dark. She prepared their simple meal, her hands steady now. She could feel their eyes on her, a weight, a pressure. They were judging her, testing her. They were trying to see into her soul, to see if she was worthy of the child she held, to see if she was worthy of Nokona's legacy. All night they stayed. Ruthin did not sleep. She sat in a chair by the window, Tabananica asleep in her lap, and watched the two dark shapes under the moon. She was not just Ruthin Arlen, the grieving widow. She was the keeper of the voice of the sun. She was the guardian of a sacred trust, and she would not fail. When the first pale light of dawn touched the sky, they were gone. As if they had been a dream, a figment of her lonely imagination. But the hoof prints in the dust at the edge of her land were real. The visits became a regular occurrence, never more than 2 or 3 riders. They would appear at dusk and disappear at dawn. They never approached, never spoke. They were a silent, watchful presence on the periphery of her life. The townspeople saw them, of course. The sightings fueled their fear and hatred. "The savages are closing in," Mr. Gable had muttered to her once, his face pale with fear, when she had been forced to go to town for salt. "They'll murder you in your bed for what you've done." Ruthin knew they were wrong. The riders were not a threat, they were a jury, and she was on trial. One day, a new rider appeared with the others. This one was older, his hair streaked with gray, his face a road map of deep, intricate lines. He sat his horse with the easy authority of a leader. He did not watch the house. He watched the 3 small graves under the mesquite tree. For hours he sat, his gaze fixed on the stones that marked the resting places of Eamon, Samuel, and Finn. Ruthin watched him from the window, her heart aching with a fresh wave of grief. He was seeing her loss, her history, the empty spaces in her life. He was reading the story of her sorrow, written in the earth. The next morning, after the riders had gone, Ruthin found something on the largest of the 3 graves, the one that belonged to Eamon. It was a single eagle feather, its tip painted red, bound to a small carved piece of wood with a strip of sinew. It was a gift, an offering, a sign of respect for a fellow warrior, perhaps, or a mother's loss. Tears streamed down Ruthin's face as she picked it up. They were the first tears she had shed in years. It was a tear not of grief, but of a profound, shattering gratitude. In that moment, she felt a connection to these silent, watchful men, a shared understanding of loss that transcended language and culture. They were not judging her sin. They were measuring her sorrow. The winter was harsh, the wind a relentless, keening thing that stripped the world to its bones. Ruthin and Tabananica huddled in the small house, their lives pared down to the essentials of warmth and food. The boy was walking now, a sturdy, determined toddler who explored every corner of their small world. He spoke few words, but his gray eyes were eloquent, his understanding deep. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, burying the world in a sea of white, there was a knock on the door. It was not the hesitant rap of a lost traveler, but a firm, deliberate sound. Ruthin's blood ran cold. The riders had never come to the door. She picked up the shotgun from above the hearth, her hands slick with sweat. She cracked the door open a few inches, the barrel of the gun steady. It was the old man, the one with the gray-streaked hair. He was alone. He was covered in snow, his face impassive, but his eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a deep, weary sadness. He held out a hand, not in a threat, but in a gesture of peace. In his palm was a small, intricately beaded pouch. He spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, the first words any of them had ever said to her. The language was foreign, but the meaning was clear. He was not there to harm them. Slowly, hesitantly, Ruthin lowered the gun and opened the door. He stepped inside, bringing the cold and the smell of the storm with him. He looked around the small, sparse room, his eyes lingering on Tabananica, who stood half-hidden behind Ruthin's skirts, his own gray eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. The old man knelt, his movements stiff with age, until he was at the boy's level. He did not try to touch him. He simply looked at him, a long, searching look. Then he opened the pouch he carried and took out a necklace. It was a simple leather thong, but on it hung a single large turquoise stone, the color of a summer sky. He held it out to the boy. Tabananica, after a moment's hesitation, reached out a small hand and took it. His tiny fingers closed around the smooth, cool stone. The old man looked at Ruthin. He spoke again, his voice soft. He said a single word, a name that Ruthin had only ever read in a dead man's letter. Nokona. He pointed to the boy, then to the necklace. Then he looked at Ruthin, and in his eyes she saw the question. It was the culmination of all the months of watching, of waiting. He was not asking if she would give the boy back. He was asking if she would accept his mother's name, his mother's story, his mother's soul. He was asking her to become Nokona, to carry her legacy, to be the bridge between two worlds for this child who belonged to both and neither. Ruthin looked down at Tabananica. He was holding the turquoise stone to his chest, his gray eyes shining in the lamplight. He was the voice of the son of the wanderer. He was her son. She met the old man's gaze, and in the depths of her own gray eyes, he found his answer. She did not need to speak. He saw the fierce, unwavering love. He saw the acceptance. He saw the strength that had been forged in the crucible of unimaginable loss. He saw a mother. He nodded, a slow, solemn gesture of acknowledgement. He stood, turned, and walked back out into the storm, closing the door softly behind him, leaving the woman and the child in the warm, lamp-lit silence. Ruthin knelt and gathered Tabananica into her arms. She held him tight, the turquoise stone cold against her cheek. The storm raged outside, but inside the small house, the trial was over. The verdict had been delivered. She was no longer just Ruthin Arlen, the widow. She was the keeper of a name, the guardian of a legacy. She was the mother of a boy with his father's blood and his mother's spirit. A boy with her eyes. Tabananica looked up at her, his face serious. He reached up a small hand and touched her cheek. And then, for the first time, he spoke a clear, perfect word. It was not Mama. It was not a name she had taught him. It was a sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, from the blood memory of a people she had never known. It was a word that held the warmth of the sun, the vastness of the sky, the sorrow of a wanderer who had finally found her way home. It was his mother's name. Nokona, he said. And in that single perfect word, Ruthen heard her own final truth. She was not just carrying a name, she had become it. She had buried 3 sons, and in their place, the land had given her a new one. A son who had, in turn, given her a new soul. The aching weight of legacy had become the anchor of her life, and the price of mothering this child was her own rebirth. The dust of the plains no longer felt like the milled bones of the dead. It felt like the soft, fertile earth of a new beginning.